In November 1875, London was wrapped in a thick winter fog. Gas lamps cast dim halos across empty streets, and the city carried itself with the confidence of an empire at its peak. To most of Britain, it was an ordinary Sunday night. To the man inside 10 Downing Street, it was anything but. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli stood awake, holding a telegram just delivered from Cairo. The paper was thin, the message brief, its implications were enormous. Egypt's ruler was bankrupt, his treasury was empty, and to avoid humiliation and collapse, he was ready to sell the one asset that mattered more than any army or colony, the Suez Canal. Disraeli did not need advisors to explain the danger. The canal was the shortest route to India, the backbone of British power. Control of it meant control of trade, military movement, and imperial survival. If Britain hesitated, France would act. If France acted, Britain's global position would weaken overnight. The problem was time. Parliament was not in session. The law forbade emergency spending, and Egypt needed cash immediately. Within 48 hours, a decision would be made that no debate or vote could reverse. A single financial move was about to alter the balance of power in the Middle East. If you value history that explains how power really works, subscribe to Hidden Chapter. This was the moment when money began to replace force as the most decisive weapon of empire. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain seemed untouchable. Its navy controlled the oceans, its factories powered global trade, its colonies spanned continents. At the heart of this system was India, an economic engine that supplied wealth, manpower, and prestige unmatched by any other possession. Then came the Suez Canal. When it opened in 1869, geography itself appeared to bend in Britain's favor. Ships traveling between Europe and Asia no longer needed to circle Africa. A journey that once took months was reduced to weeks. Steamships moved faster, trade intensified, and military forces could be deployed with unprecedented speed. The canal did not simply improve efficiency, it reshaped global power. It created the impression that Britain's dominance was locked in by infrastructure. But there was a critical flaw in that assumption. Britain did not own the canal. It had opposed its construction, dismissed it as a French ambition, and underestimated its significance. The project was designed and financed by French interests, while a large portion of the shares were held by Egypt's ruler. France appeared confident, Egypt appeared prosperous, canal tolls flowed steadily, and the waterway became the most valuable passage on earth. Yet beneath this confidence lay instability. Egypt's finances were already unraveling, and Britain's empire, for the first time, depended on a strategic artery it did not control. If that dependency broke, the consequences would extend far beyond the desert. Khedive Ismail believed that modernization was not a luxury, but a necessity. In a world dominated by European powers, he feared that any nation that did not modernize would be swallowed by those that did. Egypt, in his vision, would no longer be treated as an eastern province, but as a modern state worthy of European respect. To achieve this, he spent aggressively. Railways cut across the countryside, telegraph lines connected distant regions. Grand palaces, opera houses, and boulevards rose from the dust of Cairo. Foreign architects were hired, European ceremonies were staged. Egypt looked modern, impressive, and expensive. But this transformation was built on borrowed money. Domestic revenue could not support the scale of Ismail's ambitions, so Egypt turned to European banks. Loans poured in quickly, often at punishing interest rates. As long as Egypt appeared to be progressing, lenders remained confident. Credit flowed not because the economy was healthy, but because it looked convincing. This system rewarded image over substance. Repayment depended on unstable income, especially cotton exports and canal dividends. When global prices fell, Egypt's revenues collapsed overnight. The loans did not. By the 1870s, interest payments absorbed nearly all state income. Egypt still had a ruler, a flag, and an army, but it no longer controlled its finances. Sovereignty remained on paper. Power had moved elsewhere. Modernization had not failed. It had succeeded, just not for Egypt. Debt had quietly transformed progress into captivity. European banks did not lend to Egypt out of optimism or misunderstanding. They lent because they saw leverage. By the early 1870s, bankers in London and Paris knew Egypt's finances were unsustainable. They could see the books. They understood that repayment depended not on growth, but on control. And control was precisely what the loans provided. Each new infusion of capital came with conditions that were rarely announced to the public. Foreign financial advisors were embedded inside Egypt's treasury. Tax revenues were redirected before they ever reached the state budget. Entire income streams, from customs duties to canal dividends, were pledged directly to creditors. Egypt still collected taxes, but it no longer decided how they were used. This was not invasion, it was administration. Britain and France did not need armies to shape Egyptian policy. They needed accountants, auditors, and legal authority. Decisions once made in Cairo were now reviewed in European capitals. Budgets were no longer political documents, they were repayment schedules. The Suez Canal, originally presented as Egypt's path to independence, became its most valuable collateral. Its revenues reassured lenders, its shares guaranteed influence. The canal no longer symbolized sovereignty, it underwrote dependency. When Khedive Ismail asked for relief, forgiveness was never considered. European creditors did not reduce debts or slow interest, they demanded oversight. Financial supervision replaced national authority, quietly but completely. To the outside world, Egypt appeared intact. It still had a ruler, its institutions still functioned, its flag still flew. But power had shifted. What arrived as assistance was, in reality, a transfer of decision-making from a state to its creditors. Borders remained unchanged, armies stayed in their barracks. Yet Egypt's autonomy eroded with every loan agreement signed. This was a new form of imperialism, one that crossed borders without crossing armies. Finance had learned how to rule without ruling. By late 1875, Khedive Ismail had exhausted every alternative. Another major debt payment was approaching, and there was no money left to meet it. The treasury was empty. State salaries went unpaid. Confidence in his rule was evaporating. Default would not only destroy Egypt's credit, it would invite foreign intervention and almost certainly cost him his throne. Under that pressure, Ismail turned to the only asset he still controlled, his shares in the Suez Canal. They were never meant to be sold. They represented Egypt's future leverage, its claim to independence in a world dominated by empires. But survival required immediacy. He quietly offered the shares for sale at a fixed price, £4 million, cash, without delay. France understood the opportunity instantly. Purchasing the shares would give Paris near total control over the canal and decisive influence over the route to India. French officials were prepared to act. Britain was not. Under British law, government spending required parliamentary approval, and Parliament was not in session. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli knew that delay meant defeat. If the shares were sold elsewhere, the loss would be irreversible. Britain's global position would be weakened for generations. With no legal path available, Disraeli chose a financial one. He turned to the Rothschild banking house, a private institution capable of mobilizing vast sums faster than any state. The request was extraordinary. The security was not land, bullion, or assets, but the credibility of the British government itself. The Rothschilds agreed. Within hours, the funds were advanced, the shares were transferred. Britain now owned nearly half of the most strategic waterway on Earth. The immediate crisis was resolved. Egypt avoided default. For the moment, Britain secured its imperial lifeline, but something essential had been surrendered. A sovereign state had exchanged long-term autonomy for short-term survival. A government had bypassed its own laws to preserve power, and finance had proven it could achieve what diplomacy and war could not. Once the sale was completed, there was no path back. This was not a rescue. It was an irreversible exchange. History would follow from it. In Britain, the purchase of the Suez Canal shares was hailed as a triumph of statecraft. Newspapers praised Benjamin Disraeli's speed and daring. Political rivals, even those who opposed imperial expansion, were forced to acknowledge the public's approval. When Parliament returned and formally endorsed the deal, the matter seemed settled. Britain had secured its route to India without firing a shot. The empire appeared safer overnight. Trade through the canal continued uninterrupted. Revenues flowed, dividends were paid. From London, the transaction looked clean, efficient, and decisive. A financial maneuver had protected global power, and the risks appeared contained. But this sense of victory rested on distance. In Egypt, the £4 million provided no renewal, no reform, and no stability. The money did not build institutions or reduce dependence. It disappeared almost immediately into interest payments owed to European creditors. Within months, Egypt was again unable to meet its obligations. The underlying financial structure remained intact, only now it was more exposed. What had changed was Britain's position. By purchasing the shares, Britain ceased to be an observer. It became a stakeholder. Canal revenues now mattered directly to British finances. Any disruption in Egypt threatened not just trade, but investment. Financial exposure created political interest, and political interest demanded influence. Influence, in turn, created responsibility. What had once been Egypt's internal crisis became a British concern. Decisions in Cairo could no longer be ignored in London. Stability was no longer optional. It was necessary to protect assets. And protecting assets meant involvement. The problem had not been resolved, it had been absorbed. The celebration in Britain masked a deeper shift. A financial success had quietly bound the empire to the fate of another state. What looked like a clean victory was, in reality, the first step into permanent entanglement. The crisis had been postponed, not prevented. Within a year of the canal sale, Egypt collapsed again. The temporary relief provided by the transaction had changed nothing fundamental. The debts were still there, the revenues were still inadequate, and the system that had trapped the country remained intact. This time, Britain and France no longer had the option of distance, because they now held direct financial interests in Egypt, especially through the Suez Canal. They could not allow disorder, default, or political instability to threaten repayment. What had once been Egypt's internal problem was now a European concern. Financial exposure demanded intervention. The response was administrative before it was military. British and French officials imposed direct oversight of Egypt's finances. Taxes were raised sharply, spending was slashed, wages were cut, customs revenues and agricultural income were redirected to service foreign debt. These measures were rational on paper, but devastating in practice. Soldiers went unpaid, peasants were squeezed. The state functioned, but only to satisfy creditors. Public anger followed quickly. Many Egyptians no longer saw their government as sovereign. They saw it as an extension of foreign interests, collecting taxes at home to pay debts abroad. Nationalist sentiment spread through the army and the streets. Stability once assumed began to fracture. In 1882, violence broke out in Alexandria. Britain responded with force. The intervention was framed as a temporary measure to restore order and protect vital infrastructure. British leaders insisted they had no desire to rule Egypt. They claimed they would withdraw once stability returned. They did not. British troops remained for 70 years. What began as a financial transaction had become a military occupation. Each step had followed logically from the last. Buying shares required protecting revenues. Protecting revenues required controlling policy. Controlling policy required force. The outcome was not the result of sudden aggression or conspiracy. It was the predictable conclusion of financial dependency. By the time the first soldiers landed, the invasion had already happened, on paper. In the immediate aftermath, the outcome appeared clear. Britain secured its most vital imperial lifeline. Control of the Suez Canal guaranteed access to India, protected global trade routes, and reinforced Britain's position as the world's dominant power. France, though outmaneuvered, retained influence through finance and diplomacy. The Rothschilds earned their return, along with something more valuable than interest, proof that private capital could move faster and shape outcomes more decisively than any parliament or army. But the deeper consequences unfolded elsewhere. For Egypt, the transaction marked the effective end of sovereignty. What had begun as a financial emergency ended as long-term subordination. Decisions once made by rulers in Cairo were now shaped by creditors in London and Paris. Taxes collected from Egyptian farmers were redirected to foreign bondholders. Infrastructure built in the name of progress became justification for permanent oversight. The state remained, but authority had drained away. The Middle East inherited this structure. The Suez Canal deal established a model that would be repeated across the region. Debt followed by supervision, supervision followed by intervention, intervention followed by occupation. Railways, ports, and canals, presented as neutral instruments of modernization, became anchors of foreign control. Borders were drawn, governments were installed, and policies were enforced to protect financial interests rather than local stability. This shift reshaped global power. The episode demonstrated that influence no longer required conquest. Control could be achieved through urgency, liquidity, and leverage. A government facing immediate collapse would accept terms it would otherwise reject. Once accepted, those terms created obligations that expanded quietly over time. Finance did not replace empire, it redesigned it. The Suez Canal was not seized by force in 1875. No shots were fired, no flags were lowered, yet the outcome proved as decisive as any battlefield victory. 48 hours and alone accomplished what decades of diplomacy could not. This is the lasting lesson of the Suez deal. Power does not always announce itself with armies and banners. Often it arrives with contracts, interest schedules, and deadlines. By the time consequences appear, the decision has already been made. History did not change course when troops entered Egypt. It changed course when the loan was approved. Subscribe to the hidden chapter for history that reveals how money quietly shapes the fate of nations.